We are going to begin a study of the book of Job. Sin, suffering, and sovereignty, and the relationships between them. A lot of misconceptions. How many of you have read the entire book of Job? Whoa, that's unusual. I thought I'd have a handful. Well, good. Those of you who didn't put your hand up, don't feel bad. But your assignment is to read the whole book. Most people know about the beginning. They all know that story about the angels and put Job through the ringer. And a lot of people know about the end. No, but not very many people understand all the argumentation that goes on in the middle, and you can get lost in it. It deals with a very hard subject, which is suffering and its relationship to sin. Many people think it's, why do bad things happen to good people? But that rabbi that wrote that book years ago, it does not answer that question. It doesn't deal with it. It deals with the relationship between sin, suffering, and the sovereignty of God. And the other thing, as I've gone through this thing, it's a dark subject, but it's a beautiful book. They say things that you could reduce to a few sentences, but they say them in some of the most beautiful ways. And you gain so much more by listening to what they said. If you're going to read through it and study it, I recommend you do this. You take each discourse, each person. Job speaks about 4 times. He starts with his lament in chapter 3, and then you have Eliphaz and all the way to Elihu, and they have their speeches. Read their speech, write down a couple sentences as what's the point, what is the point he's making, and then go back and just enjoy the way he says it and all of the insights that he brings. Now, Job's friends are not necessarily theologians, and they're not necessarily right, but you really get a feeling for some of the things that they see. And so we're going to enjoy going through that. Job is included in your Bible in with what we call the wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And these are called wisdom literature because they deal with the deep questions that bother people the most. The things that are about our internal life mostly, and how the world outside, how to deal with it. When, for example, Psalms is the poetry of the heart. When you are struggling, when you are asking deep questions, you're driven to the Psalms. Somebody feel me? But Billy Graham used to say when he was having a difficult time and he was really struggling with a crusade, he would be driven to the Psalms. And Proverbs, of course, practical wisdom, the things you need to learn how to live in the world and answer a lot of the questions about practical living. Ecclesiastes is philosophy. It's about the meaning of life. And then Song of Solomon is erotic love between a man and a woman. That's a big deal. I mean, 90% of all the songs you're listening to on the radio are about that very thing. And it's one of the most important and influential things in our lives. And it has overtones of the relationship between God and his church, between Christ and his church. Now, Job deals with this terrible subject of suffering. And if you want to have people get going in a Bible study, you want to talk about suffering, because everybody has suffered. And it talks about this subject, though, in kind of a hybrid way. This is not just purely wisdom literature. It's also history. It's also a narrative of something that happened a long time ago. It really might have been included with Genesis because it is a historical book. Now, I want to talk about that, where we got the book from. This is our intro. We generally do these housekeeping issues. Tradition identifies Moses as the fellow who gave us Job. In other words, he took whatever source records were from Job's family, he edited them like he did Genesis. You remember Genesis? You all remember what the Toledot documents were? Okay, there's 12 of them. This is a list of them right here. Toledot is the beginning of a narrative. And it kind of, I like to look at it as it's the beginning of a tablet that was passed on down through Noah all the way down. And it tells you the story. Toledot is sometimes translated the generations of. In other words, it speaks of the descendants of, but it's also the account of And its real meaning is the account of what proceeded, whether it's generations and people or events, from this patriarch's life. Okay, so the first four up here are the ones that tell us everything we know about the pre-flood world, which is perilously little. One of my great desires is in heaven, I really want to sit down and find out all the questions that I have about what went on back then. So the Nephilim and Eden and all those other things, I really want to know what it really was. The next two, this tells us how the sons of Noah became nations. You have the Table of Nations and the Tower of Babel, how they were scattered. But then it goes back to just one son, to Shem, and it talks about his line, and it gives the genealogies, and that in chapter 11 links up with chapter 5, which talks about Adam to Shem. And this is how most of us get our biblical chronology, okay? And we learn from them. Then once you're here, Terah, that's Abraham's father, then you're going from the patriarchs all the way down to Egypt, okay? Now, why wasn't Job put in there? I mean, if Moses did both of them, you could ask the question, well, why did he put that in? Job should be right there in that family of documents between the flood and Abraham. Well, the Genesis accounts, these Toledot documents, are united by one single thread. Can anybody tell me what that is? It's the line of Messiah. What's the Bible about? Well, once you pass Genesis 3, the Bible is about one thing, and that is God's plan to make it right, to redeem mankind that has fallen into sin and been alienated from him, to restore the world, actually to recreate the heavens and the earth, and to live forever with his people. And that is the thread that the Bible is hung on. It goes all the way from here down to Israel, from Israel to David, to the son of David, all the way out. So the things that unite this are that family. Well, what about Job? Well, Job would have probably been from a different branch of Shem's family. I think he's a Semite, which is descendants of Sem. He could have been from Ham, he could have been from Japheth, but where he lived makes us think he was a Semite. And so get an idea of how this may have occurred. Shem had a bunch of sons, lots of them, okay? But the two that matter are Arphaxad and his descendants, which go down to Aber and Abraham. Aber, we get the word Hebrew from. When I say I am a Hebrew, I am in the descendants of Aber, okay? And that goes all the way down to Abraham, and then, of course, down to the patriarchs, down to Moses, and so on and so forth. Aram was another son of Shem, and his son was Uz. Not to be confused with Abraham's nephew Uz and his brother Buz. So there's Uz and Buz, but we're talking about an older Uz from further back, okay? And so I'm saying Uz, like all these sons, migrated in a different direction. The world's empty. It's your oyster. You can go anywhere you want, and if you can defend your own city, you've got a city. And that's what they did in those days. They didn't have to worry about indigenous peoples. There were none. And so the world was open to them, and they all moved in different directions. Abraham's line, we know, went and stayed down at the bottom of Mesopotamia, and then went back up to Haran and down to Canaan. Uz would have migrated in a different direction. And so the record of Uz's family, which would include Job's story, would have not been together with these documents. It's somewhere else. So the question is, how did Moses get them? Well, Moses would have received these documents from the elders of Israel in Egypt, right? I mean, they were passed down from Noah to his son Shem, all the way down to Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob, down into Egypt to the elders of Israel, to Moses. That's easy to understand. Well, where did Moses get the book of Job? Well, he spent 40 years in the land of Midian. And his father-in-law was the high priest of Midian, a very important figure. And his name was Jethro. And he could well have been the custodian of these accounts he could be the one that gave them to Moses, either while Moses was living there, married to his daughter, or later on when they were at Sinai and Jethro came down and paid him a visit, and may have handed this document to him at the time. So that makes sense. Job's a real person, comes from a real family, lived in a real land. Land called the land of Uz. Let's read the first 3 verses of Job chapter 1. And that's Jack.
There lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East.
I love the way it begins. In the land of Uz, there was a man, kind of like in a galaxy far, far away. Simple statement. He lived in the land of Uz. Well, where's the land of Uz? Well, the land of Uz is neither a nation nor a country. It does give us a hint. It says he is among the people of the East. And when we say East in the Bible, we mean east of Israel, right? All the directions are generally like north of Israel, south, that's Egypt, south of Israel, east is east of Israel. So these are people of the East, and they would have included the people who became the nations of Ammon, Moab, Edom, and then later on Midian. Up here, we got Ammon way at the top, and then Moab is this area right here. Okay, these are the plains of Moab, and that's where Joshua mustered all the people and eventually entered into the promised land, right? Where did Ammon and Moab come from, by the way? No, Albert. Lot, right? Those were his 2 daughters after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Then they had an incestuous relationship because they needed descendants. And so Ammon and Moab came from them. Where did Edom come from? Esau, that's right. Jacob, remember Jacob and Esau met way up here when Jacob was on his way back from hiding. And he was terrified as to what Esau would do to him because Esau had like 600 men. And they made up. And then Esau, it said, migrated to the south, and he would be south of the Dead Sea in an area called Mount Seir. And these are the mountains we know of as Mount Seir. So this land included a lot of real estate, right? The interesting thing is these people didn't exist, but the land was very, very different from what you see there in that satellite picture. Radically different. Look at in Genesis 13, verse 10, Lot and Abraham are trying to decide how are we going to separate because we're just getting too big for one, to be in the same place. Abraham says to Lot, look, we're up here on the mountain, somewhere in the Judean hills, and you look out all around you. Decide where you want to go. I'll go in the opposite direction. So what does he say? In Genesis 13, verse 10.
The Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt toward Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay. The whole land was well watered and green, like the garden of the Lord. Anybody been to Israel? Okay. How many been to Masada? You go up there, right? And you take a look down, and this is what you see. Does that look well watered and green? Not at all, right? Well, how could that be? Not only that, he says that Egypt was like the garden of the Lord. Well, the reason we think that is so is that we're in the aftermath of the flood. Now, Abraham lived somewhere between 300 and 600 years. I'm sorry, 600 and 900 years after the flood. So there's a gap in there. And I would say Lot would be somewhere in the middle there. And the valley of the Jordan River would be rich and green. Sodom and Gomorrah, all the cities around the Dead Sea were there. And Egypt was like, well, we're told by archaeologists that Egypt was covered with lakes with fish, and they get fossilized fish and all kinds of things from it. About the time Abraham lived, the Sahara was beginning to dry out, and it was by that time a savanna, kind of like Africa, the grassland. It didn't support much green at that point. But back in the days of Job, it was green. It was a different place completely. Now, it was frontier country, obviously. You had to defend yourself. The Bible gives us a few clues just to locate this land. Let's look at Lamentations 4:21. This is Jeremiah.
Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who live in the land of Uz.
Daughter of Edom. Edom is another word, well, another word for Esau. And Edom is in this land over here. And it says that Edom is in the land of Uz. So that's kind of where this guy lived, this guy Job. The Midianite connection makes a lot of sense because the Midianites were down in here. Remember we did the Exodus, the Mount Sinai and so forth was really in this area. They crossed the Red Sea right here. And so this is kind of the Midian area. Midian's borders for nomadic people kind of going up and down. But anyway, they essentially overlap with Edom. And so it makes a lot of sense that Job's story came to us from Moses through the Midianites. So bottom line, Job's home was east of Canaan, south of the Dead Sea, somewhere in the lands that became Edom and Midian. Okay? And if those nations did not really exist at that time, then when did he live? What were the times of Job? You're never going to get away without seeing the timeline in my when I teach. So here we go. For those who are new to this, I'll make it real quick. This is the timeline of biblical history, about 1,600 years from the creation to the flood. And then Christ is the centerpiece of all history. We broke it up into 500 years coming before Christ, well, coming down here after the flood. We have Abraham, put Job in here. Abraham, Moses, David, Nehemiah. And then after Christ, we have Muhammad, the Crusades, the Reformation, and W. Bush was elected president. And sometime in the near future, we will see the second coming of Christ, the tribulation, and then the millennium, and then the breakdown, if you're pre-mill, which I am. So that's how that works. So I think based on the things we just talked about, Job goes somewhere in here. Not that far away from the flood, a little bit before Abraham, certainly before Moses. Okay, and there's a lot of reasons for saying that. Henry Morris says this in his commentary on Job. Go ahead and read that, Jack.
The book of Job may also be the oldest book in the Bible, with the probable exception of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. There can, at least, be no question about its setting in the patriarchal period, certainly before Moses and possibly even before Abraham.
Okay. Now, I'll give you 6 reasons real quickly to put it there. Number 1, there's no mention of Israel, Moses, or Abraham. None whatsoever. And since they're central to the Bible, and this is the Jewish canon, Job must have been living before then. Secondly, there's no mention of the 10 Commandments or the law given at Sinai. However, there is mention of commandments. Well, that's interesting. This is spoken to Isaac. God is speaking to him, reaffirming the call of Abraham. He's speaking about Abraham in Genesis 26:5. And what does he say there?
Because Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws.
Well, so this is before Moses, right? So we could go through other passages. I'm not going to go and read them all, but Job refers to God's commands in 23:12. Jack?
Oh. I have not departed from the commands of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my daily bread.
What does that tell you? That tells you that prior to Moses, there were known the commands of God. We just don't know how they knew them. Now, we know that we have a conscience, but this seems to be more definite than that. It's just an intriguing note to say that God spoke his words to his people and revealed himself in ways we don't know prior to the flood and certainly prior to Moses. Let me back up. Sacrificial offerings by the patriarch. Job chapter 1, verses 4-5.
His sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering to each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom.
Now, the sacrifices that were made, where did they come from? I mean, we're talking about Moses way back here. He's 500 to 900 years afterwards. Where did these sacrifices come from? Well, they come from Genesis. If you go back to Genesis 2:25, I want to invert those two on you, Jack. 2:25, I'll just recite it. It says, God has brought Eve to Adam, and he's excited. He says, this is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. You shall become woman. And for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and so on and so forth. And then it has this curious statement. They were both naked, and they weren't afraid, or weren't ashamed. What put that in? Why is that? I mean, I get it. I mean, you don't have any clothes. All right, fine. But why do they put that as it's as important as anything?
Covered with God's glory.
Oh, that's a good thought. He was covered with God. Very, very, very good. Very good. I think it's the setup for chapter 3, verse 21. God is just about to drive them out of the garden. Now remember, they did not walk out of the garden and say, okay, you don't want me here anymore, I'm on my way. God drove them out. And I want you to imagine being driven out of God's garden and out of his presence. Talk about crying, weeping, gnashing of teeth. Just said, please, no. And off they go. But just before that, Genesis 3:21, what does it say?
The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them.
Oh, now they're not naked anymore. And that's what it takes to be unashamed. The person is naked, he's ashamed. I mean, it's shameful. I remember one of the things that the Nazis did. If I went through Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Israel, and one of the things the Nazis would do is take, especially women, and just completely disrobe them. And there were some pictures there, a little bit strange. And they're there like this. They're huddled together. They're ashamed. Why? Nakedness is a symbol of our brokenness before God. We are unclean, and we want that covered up. And so before God drives them out, he gives them coverings. And to do that, what do you have to do? You have to kill some animals. And it always has impressed me. When God, who has just made the whole world and all these, Adam's gone and named them all, and just so wonderful. And here he slits the throat of the animal and he skins it and he pulls the skin off and he puts it on top of them. They must have been horrified. What are you doing? And then he drove them out. And the next thing that we see is in chapter 4, where God has said, you and I have now separated. I am withdrawn from your presence. You are not in my presence. If you want to address me, you must be covered with the blood of an innocent animal. And the way we're going to do that is you're going to bring a sacrifice periodically to me of an innocent creature who's going to give its life, because it's his life for your life. But the fact that he didn't do that initially tells you something else. We have two doctrines here. We have the doctrine of covering and the doctrine of atonement. The doctrine of atonement is that the only way our sins can be expunged and paid for is an innocent substitute must give life for life. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's why Cain's sacrifice was rejected completely. And God said, look, you can do what's right. What do you mean right? Right is what God had told him to do. Abel did it right. Now you can do it right. Why don't you just give him a watermelon and take a sheep and come, you know? And God has made provision for atonement. But the fact that it's a covering tells us one other thing. That atonement is not complete. It must be continually done. Because the blood of goats and sheep and animals cannot atone for your sin. It can only cover it. And there's coming a Redeemer who is the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. His life for your life will pay it and settle it. That's why Jesus said when it was done, to tell us that it is done, it is over, it is finished. And that word means it's paid in full. So that's where this came from. So from that time on, the patriarch of the family was the one that made the sacrifices. We see that with Noah, right? After the flood, he set up an altar. We see that with Abraham. We see it with Jacob. We see it with all these guys prior to the law of Moses being given. Even Job's visitors are told by God, make a sacrifice, 7 bulls. And they did. So that's the third reason that we think it's back then. One other one is there's no hint of pantheism, polytheism, idolatry, or evolution in the book. Nowhere's in there. Now, you would expect that in those ancient times. When we look at ancient history, it's full of that stuff, beginning at Babel, right? The idea to reestablish connection with the gods, the idea to be God, the identification of God with nature. Romans 1 tells us about that. God to them, as you read through this, is transcendent, and he's solitary. He's the omnipotent creator. He is perfect justice, and he is merciful. That's the God that they know. They're not that far from Noah. And Noah knew who that was. So the descent into polytheistic idolatry, really, that started in Babel, which is why we call it harlot Babylon in Revelation, that descent had not really affected Job's family yet. I even wonder if perhaps Uz, the son of Shem, the grandson of Shem, maybe he bypassed Babel. Didn't have to go to Babel. They all followed Nimrod to Babel, and that's where God confused their languages. But maybe Uz decided, I'm going southwest. And he completely escaped that. But regardless, it's a long time ago, well before these things took root in his life. Fifth reason, they all of his friends and all of the commentary in Job attest to the early events of Genesis. They talk about the creation. There's no Gilgamesh epic. They talk about the fall, the flood, the dispersion. They're all mentioned. And all the people that they mention, if they talk about nations, they're the ones that are in chapter 10 of Genesis, Table of Nations. And it does not include later nations like Moab, Ammon, Greece, or any of those, Philistines, none of that. So they really are placing themselves very close to the flood that way. And then the last one, which is the most interesting, and we will talk about this later, is when God talks about two creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, chapters 40 and 41. And they're very, very much like giant dinosaurs. Now that's fun to talk about, especially with kids. But we'll get into that because there's a lot to do with those two creatures. And I would say that dinosaurs came through the flood on the ark like everything else. Maybe they took babies, maybe they took eggs. I don't know. But they didn't last long because the earth was different. It was like the garden of the Lord back then, but eventually it became like it is today. And there just wasn't enough for them to survive. And so they're gone. So Morris says its setting, structure, and theme, and all the references internally correspond to this period between the flood and Abraham. Leonard.
Bart, I want to get something straight here, and let me go in retrospect. Moses lived somewhere in the vicinity of 1400. Okay, he wrote the Pentateuch, and more than likely people think he wrote about Job. Okay, so when he wrote it, though, he was writing in retrospect. In other words, he was covering everything from all the way through, and he gets to Job and writes about Job. However, Job was actually written before he wrote Genesis. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah. Maybe he received Job's record, his family record, when he was at Sinai, and perhaps he began editing Genesis documents before that. But I doubt it.
So everything he's writing is in retrospect, including Job.
Oh, yeah, sure. But he's writing from contemporary accounts that he received. And I think that's really important. The Bible is very, very authoritative, I think, because the source documents come from the time and the place that these things happen. Even if they were edited. Chronicles, for example, is edited, I think, by Ezra, and the Kings was edited by Jeremiah, or maybe somebody else. But they came from source documents that were contemporary with the events. Okay, so there we go. We placed Job right there between the flood and Abraham. You may get a couple of misconceptions out of the way, because I want you to imagine Job in a certain way. First of all, he is not an old and decrepit man. He lost a lot of weight during a few months, but he was not an old and decrepit man. And that's the way you always see him. Okay? You look for imagery. That's kind of what you get. And the best imagery is always like this. First of all, he was old enough to become exceptionally rich. Okay? We saw that in chapter 1. And he was the greatest man among the peoples of the East. So among all those families and peoples and cities and so forth, he was the greatest. He was politically well known. That doesn't happen overnight. And he had raised 10 children to independent adulthood, right? But he lived most of his life after these events. Take a look at Job 42, 16 and 17, Jack.
After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. And so he died old and full of years.
He lived 140 years after this point. And so if he came from this period we're talking about, that's a period when men lived to 200, 250 years. Abraham lived to 175, okay? So he probably was in his prime. He was at his peak. And I like you to look at it. This is the Sultan of the United Arab Emirates, I think, but kind of little disbelief here. That think of him as a man in his prime, his 40s to us, who was accomplished, he was powerful, he was well known. Second thing, he wasn't sitting out in the desert amid rubble. It seems like they always put him in the midst of some rubble or in a cave. No. The house that was destroyed was his oldest son's house, not his, nor any of his other children's houses. It was just that one. You get that out of chapter 1 and 2. And we'll talk about that some more. But he must have had quite a place. He's one of the leading figures in the whole Middle East. So imagine him, he's going through this in the midst of a very lovely house. He would be surrounded by some servants. It said a lot of his servants had to leave. All the farms had to go, obviously. How did we get such detail in all those discourses? I think he may well have had a scribe on the payroll. Because when the king speaks, somebody's there to write it down. When major people speak, the president speaks, there's always a stenographer. So he may well have had that. So picture this guy as driven, powerful, centralizing character, famous and influential. Now, what do we all know Job for? What character trait? Nope, that's what I'm thinking of.
Patience.
Patience, the patience of Job. Job was not a patient man. Neither would you expect a guy who is this driven, this powerful, this influential to be necessarily patient. He didn't suffer fools gladly. In fact, it's very interesting when Eliphaz, Job kicks off the conversation in chapter 3 with his lament, and then Eliphaz, who must be the oldest of the 3 friends, he comes to talk to him. And we see this in verse 4, 2, chapter 4, verse 2.
If someone ventures a word with, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking?
He said, now look, Job, don't be impatient with me. I got something to say. I'd like you to listen. I don't think he was all that patient a guy. Later on, he is bordering on blasphemy. And he is accusing God, and he is demanding, is he going to kill me? Get on with it. Right? So at the outset of his ordeal, and I want to look at Job before we start his suffering, he would have been hale and hearty. And even though he was deeply grieved at the first round, he was still energetic and strong. And you consider what he was doing during these early phase of his troubles before his health was taken. He had funerals to go to. He had damage assessments. He had insurance claims. He still had his duties in the gate. He is a political creature, right? He had medical appointments, especially when his disease started. He would have been responding like any driven type A personality. Okay? So he's not a helpless victim who just, is this ancient skin and bone sitting there. He turned into one eventually, pretty much. But at the beginning, this is the kind of man he was. Did you have something to say, Alvin? I didn't want to cut you off.
His 3 critics, one of them says, one of us or some of us are older than your father, which means Job was not all that old.
Right. Good. All right. So next week, we're going to see how his suffering wore him down. And that's quite a story. But I want to talk about the Job before his ordeal began. It's interesting in chapter 1, verse 8, the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Now, if you go back to verse 1 and 2, it says, in the land of Uz, there was a man called Job. He was blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. But when God speaks about him to the angels and to Satan, he says, there is no man on earth like him. Now, if God says that about you, you're somebody, right? He's saying, this guy is superlative. He's unique. He is the best of men. He ought to be our example of men. How many of you have read articles, books, heard people discuss the subject of where are the men in recent years? Anyone? Anybody heard them? Yeah. Riley Gaines, absolutely. Right. Where are the men? I mean, you'll read article after article. They're not marrying. They're not fathering children. Well, heck, they're not even having sexual relations in the era of free love. They're not working hard. They're out to enjoy their lives. I'm in the market for husbands. I got several granddaughters, marrying age. Preach it, babe. Right? These are beautiful girls. I mean, they're physically beautiful. They're intelligent, educated, committed to Christ. And their father says to me, where are the men? I'm looking for men like Job. So let's just talk about some of the things. I want to give you 4 characteristics of Job, what I would call the moral characteristics, and 2 that are the result of the 4. So let's just start. It says in this verse, he fears God. He fears God. What does it mean to fear God? Reverent. What else? Does it mean to be afraid of God? Not at all.
I think that when he says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom,
We'll get there, yeah.
well, he was a wise man, but I fear God because of his power and also because of his holiness.
Oh, yeah. I feared my dad. I did. Yeah, Len.
But one of the things that we learned as Catholics growing up, I learned as a Catholic growing up, is the fear and reverence and holiness of God. I got that down pretty well from the Catholic faith. What I didn't get down is also the love of God. But the fear of God certainly was a respect, an understanding of his holiness, an understanding that he can, if he wants to, do whatever he wants with you.
Exactly.
Because he is sovereign and omnipotent.
You are in his hands. Right. Fear God. I remember we had an after church school at church, after school kind of a studies, like communion classes at our church. And my dad was the pastor, and I had really cut up bad, and I was in big trouble, and I knew I was going to get a licking. And I was walking home, and it was only about, a quarter mile. And I was ahead of my dad. And then I remember him like it was yesterday, coming right by me and up and into the driveway, and he was going to be waiting for me. And the reason I remember that is because he had a loaner car, and it was an Edsel. Funny things you remember, right? But I remember he was going to be waiting for me. I was going to get a lick. I was going to get chastised. I feared him because there were consequences to my deeds. I knew he loved me, no question about that. But I did fear him. Alistair Begg, I was listening to one of his sermons not long ago, last week, and he quoted an author whose name I don't remember. And he said, the God of the modern American church is weightless. He is weightless. He exists for our needs. He can be ignored at will. He does not place on us any obligations that we can't just throw out. And if we sin, he'll forgive us. The God of the American people are weightless. I'm looking for husbands that fear God. Second thing he says is he shuns evil. And I love the King James Version. He eschews evil. That's kind of like he spits it out. He doesn't want anything to do with it. He avoids evil. He separates himself. And here's where I think of the illustration Len likes to give us from Genesis 1:1. God created the heavens and the earth, and then he said, "Let there be light," and so forth. And he says that's a pattern for the way God cleans up a life. He says the life begins in darkness and chaos. God's spirit moves. He creates light. And then he separates the light from the darkness. You are children of light if you belong to Jesus Christ, and you should be separate from darkness. I love well, it says the sister word in this phrase here is blameless. Nobody can blame him. And I think immediately of Mike Pence. Do you remember when he was ridiculed and criticized for his rule that he would not have a closed-door meeting alone with a woman? And then came the Me Too movement. Has the Me Too movement ever touched him? No. Believe me, they'd love to if they could. Yeah, Mike Pence could not be blamed for sin. Then he's upright. So the negative is he shuns evil. Now it says he's upright. That word means a good, virtuous, righteous, honest. Well, I would say he's godly. He's like God. This is the positive character side. Now there are two aspects to this, to being upright. One is righteousness and one is godliness. Righteousness is the virtue or the goodness of your life in front of the world. Jesus said in the Beatitudes, he said, "Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness." Why? For they will be filled. We ought to be asking God, fill me with righteousness. Don't let me bring disgrace upon your name. And it says in Jude that now unto him that is able to keep you from falling. I like the illustration in Psalm 37 where he says, the way of a righteous man, the Lord delights in the way of a righteous man. He will hold him by his right hand. Though he stumble, he will not fall. Pray, Lord, make me righteous. Don't let me fall before a critical world. And then the other side is godly, right? And that's the character that's like God. In Romans 8, he says, it is God's intention, we are predestined to be conformed to what? The image of Jesus Christ. We are to be made like him and to be exhibiting the fruit of his spirit. Now, in many places, we hear of Job's mercy and his good works. I'm going to go to chapters 28 and 29, particularly 29. 29 is one of the most poignant passages, and I urge you to read it quietly. He's at the limit of his suffering, and he's looking back on his life, which is how we know this took several months. He says, excuse me. In the months gone by, he says, how I long for the months gone by, for the days when God watched over me, his lamp shone on my head, and so on. And he goes and talks about how his life was wonderful at one time. And in this chapter 29, we're going to get back to 20 and 29. He tells us of the good works that he did. Look at verses 15 and 16. He says, I was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy. I took up the case of the stranger. I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from their teeth. Makes me think of these courageous men who go into foreign countries and they seek out those who have been sold into sex slavery and get them released. Now that's courage. That's a good man. So he was an upright man. He's also a priest for his family. We read that in Job 1, 4, and 5. If his children fell into or celebrated, he was concerned that they might have fallen into sin. And so he offered sacrifices for them. One of the things I remember we had a sermon here talking about men, and it said men ought to step up and all the good things they ought to do. But the one thing that was missing that I would have added is they ought to be the intercessor for their family. They ought to be the one that spends the long hours before the Lord, lifting up each member of the family. They are the priest to bring their children's hands into the hand of their God. This is our job. And so he did that too. He was an upright man. I like that guy. And then he's wise. This was Alvin alluded to that. Look at 29, 21, and 22. Jack?
Men listened to me expectantly, waiting in silence for my counsel. After I had spoken, they spoke no more.
After I had spoken, they spoke more. Everybody shut up, right? He was wise. And it's interesting, chapters 28 and 29 speak of wisdom. In chapter 28, he starts out by talking about how difficult it is for men to dig up gold out of the earth and to refine it and to get crops from the earth and to do all the sorts of things that men do. But then he says, wisdom is a lot harder. He says, wisdom is a whole lot harder to get. And he then goes on in chapter 28. He says, there's a mine for silver, a place where gold is refined, iron. He goes all the way through that. And he says, but where is wisdom to be found? In verse 12. Where's wisdom to be found? Where does understanding dwell? No mortal comprehends its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. And he goes on through the deep, says, it's not with me, can't be bought with finest gold. And then he says, where does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed from the birds of the sky. And then he says, God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. For he dwells the ends of the earth. He sees everything under the heavens. Now he goes on. So I say, it's hard to teach this because you'd have to read it all to get the beauty of it. But then at verse 28, he says, and he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to shun evil is understanding. And so what we've done is we've come right back to here. He fears God and he shuns evil. Proverbs and Psalms both make that same statement. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And the older I get, the more I see that is so true. Gigi.
Your dad, and being afraid, if you do what's right, you don't have to be afraid.
Right.
And so we don't have to fear God if we're obeying what he tells us to do.
Exactly. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom is to know what to do, to know what's right, to know what's wrong, what's good and what's evil. And without God, we don't have a clue. So it boils down to this. Ecclesiastes 12, is the philosophy section, and it boils down at the very end of one of my favorite verses. Here's the conclusion of the whole matter, he says. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. I'm looking for a man who fears God, shuns evil, who is upright, does good, cares for the ones assigned to him, prays for them, a man who is wise, because he fears God. Now, because of those four moral characteristics, there are two other things that I like. Carol Ann and I were talking the other day about this and the characteristics of this guy and how he'd be a great husband for our daughters. And she says, it doesn't hurt that he's rich. Right? I pulled that ahead of his on it. I'll start with progress. Okay. He prospers. He's independent. He's self-supporting. He's a provider. People can lean on him. In Ephesians 4, we are said to work hard so that we can have something to share with those in need. We are promised great riches, but God will provide for his own. When my daughters were about to get married and they were dating, and this guy is going to come and talk to me about marrying my daughter, the girls knew how to coach him. They said, there's two words you better come up with or you're going to be out the door. One is you'll be my provider and you'll be my protector. But sure, John Gancini, he comes in and he's sitting there nervous as a cat. He says, I just want you to know that I want to be Bethany's provider and her protector. And Carol Ann's sitting there saying, Where you go? Get up in the morning and go to work. We need men like that. One of the things I pray for my grandsons is, Lord, give them a burning sense of mission. What is it you want them to do? I don't care if it's laying bricks, driving trucks, teaching school, or leading political party. That's not important. What is it that you are going to do for his glory? And then have ambition that drives you, get you up every morning. And then work toward that. Don't waste your years. How many men I hired in my company at the entry level who were 30 to 40 years old. They had squandered 10, 15 years of their lives. And so I'm looking for one of those guys. Let me back up to where it says he is honored. Job 29, 7-8.
When I went to the city gate, when I went to the gate of the city and took my seat in the public square, the young men saw me and stepped aside, and the old men rose to their feet.
Ooh, he's honored. There is honor that comes with serving God, with being upright and shunning evil. People may ridicule you, people may shun you even, but there's honor that comes. How many times have you come into a place, like in the workplace, and the story stops? The swearing stops. You know? I remember when I was checking out as a project manager in Washington, my boss, Captain Hagen, said, he said, I really remember one thing about you, and that is you came to me and told me that you didn't care for the way I used the name of your Lord. So when you come into a social setting, are people aware of it? Do they reflect that a little change in their behavior because you serve the living God? Alvin and I were talking about this morning before class, that it is an honor to teach God's people God's word. It really is. I mean, we sense how worthless we really are. I mean, we really don't know what we're doing. And we depend on the Lord to take these things we put together and bring them out to you. And I said, it's kind of like wearing his livery. See, you remember the king would ride in a coach, and you'd have these footmen standing on the back of the coach, and they're wearing a uniform, right? Identifies them with the king. They are close to the king, and they identify them. Now, they're not very important. All they got to do is open a door, right? And they're nobodies, really, but they wear that livery, and that gives them honor. So he's a man who is honored because of his closeness to the Lord, the fact that he wears his livery, and he prospers. And these are the guys, this is the kind of guy that we want. We want to encourage, most of us have grandchildren, but some of us have sons, right? We want to encourage our sons to be that kind of man, our grandsons to be that kind of man, and our daughters and granddaughters to find that kind of man. Be willing to wait till God provides. Now, we think that he's nothing but a great guy, right? He had a weakness, very interesting weakness, which I think is instructive. And we're going to finish up with that. He's overconfident. At least when he was younger. And this is in Job 29. Remember, he says, oh, I long for the months gone by, with the days when God watched over me, and blah, 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 blah. And everything was wonderful. People listened to me. They'd shut their mouths. They'd all this other stuff. Okay. But look at verses 18 to 20. Jack?
I thought, I will die in my own house, my days as numerous as the grains of sand. My roots will reach to the water, and the dew will lie all night on my branches. My glory will remain fresh in me, the bow ever new in my hand.
Wow. This is a good life. It's going to go on this way forever. And this is one of his misconceptions. Job thinks that he deserves his good life because of all these good things that he does. I serve God. I pray. I intercede for my children. I do good works. Surely this is the way to a good life. He is echoing the modern health, wealth, and prosperity gospel. And he needs to be disabused of that. There is no direct connection between my virtuous acts and the prosperity and the blessing that goes on in my life. Now, the rule is generally God blesses his children. But Job is an example of where he may ask us to go through serious suffering. He expects to be honored and to be powerful all of his life. I think that was earlier in his life because we see in chapter 3 something that's a little bit out of, it's kind of a dissonant phrase or dissonant sound. I think he had a kind of premonition that trouble was on the horizon. Job 3:25, what does he say?
What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me.
I think somewhere, and maybe this was God's mercy, he began to wonder if this might hold. Is this really going to go on forever? What if this goes away? I mean, any of us who have owned a business, tried to make it go, know how quickly money can come and how quickly it can go, right? Nothing's secure in this world. And maybe he began to wonder about that. Maybe this good life won't last forever. And the fact of the matter is, Job, for all his goodness, was not really completely prepared for what was to come. He had many misconceptions about God. And they're revealed as we go forward in these big arguments that he has with his friend. And really, that's what the story is about. It's about getting Job to understand more clearly the relationship between sin, suffering, and God's sovereignty. Aren't we in a similar situation? Oh, let me back up. This story is about teaching him what he needs to know, but he succeeds because he has one overriding characteristic that actually overcomes all the others. And that is that he trusted in the living God, and he never, no matter how hard they beat on him, he would not let go of that. He says in 13:15, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And he repeats that phrase, I will trust him, over and over through the book. Now, aren't we in a similar situation? I think we are. I think life is good. We were talking yesterday. In the heat of summer, we can afford the time to spend an hour and float around in the pool at the end of the day. That's a pretty good deal. I like that life. Carol Ann says to me, she says, we have a good life. Yeah, we do. We do. No question. But we shouldn't live as though it won't change. And I think we are beginning to feel a little bit of dread, like Job did, that there's a storm on the horizon. And we may be subject to suffering. And it's a good idea that we absorb the lessons of Job, that we might be prepared. And that we might pray, Lord, thank you for the goodness of my life. I'm telling you, I'm reaping so much blessing. And thank you. We don't deserve it, but thank you. But Lord, prepare us for anything that might be lying ahead. You know, I don't. And I think God will prepare us for whatever storms or suffering lie ahead. We should pray that we will increase in our conviction, stiffen our backbones, our commitment, our love for the Lord, and our knowledge of his will. So next week, we'll get down to what did it take to break Job? And that's an instructive story in its own, and a little bit about the angels and the sons of God.